and so they were centered around emissions, and then they just spread. Anyways, just some interesting stuff. So we've been affecting the fine fuel load in California since that time. And then, of course, some of the Spanish missions, they had they didn't really like fire. They were used to the European model of fire, although they were a little more used to it coming out of the Mediterranean. But in general, it's always been the European model to reduce fire. So stop having fire on the landscape. So, fast forward to the American policy, the American government coming in. Late 1890s was about the first time that the American policies really started dictating all the way across the country. Again, it was just continuation of cessation of inputting fire into the landscape, suppressing ignitions, and then, of course, from that, as we know, fuels began to accumulate. Dry brush and trees began to accumulate, according to the National Fire Plan. So then now we get to the 80s, and they're really, although Aldo Leopold in their paper starts to talk about this fire deficit, but the 80s really became to be this fire deficit, as it came to be called, which is that basically we haven't had enough fires. Some of these let burn policies, Biswell was doing his thing a little bit before that, with the late 60s and into this time. Forest Service, we wanted to try to do some things to relieve that pressure, but largely failed. And then now, what I would consider, and I think most people would agree with, is that we recognize that fire regimes have been altered, maybe too far. I talk about Newtonian physics here, which is that once you set something in motion, it's hard to get it to stop. So we really have set a lot of things in motion, and you bring in all the other things that we've recognized as their factors now, such as climate change, species introductions, shifting ecosystems, way too much fire, not enough fire, all these sort of things. And now we're left in a position where we have to try to fix it, right? Because we're human beings, we always want to try to fix things or make things that equal our moral standards. Make sense? So that's kind of a quick history. Any questions? Any disagreements? So, going into the early days of the Forest Service, we talked about already the native peoples were the first entry into America, into the American vegetation scene, and of course began to affect the fuel strata. European settlement, Spanish and British. When did a fuels problem begin to appear? Any idea when we first? I know you're probably reading the slides, but any idea when we first have the ramifications or the effects of a fuels problem?
I think the very beginning, because we were all wilderness, the nation was predominantly, and they had to build roads for manifest destiny, and
That's right.
they were counting on that. I think initially we were planters on the coast with slaves and all that, but then they moved more west.
Yeah, it's a good perspective, really. I mean, kind of a fuel/fire problem has always been viewed as such from the very beginning. But we didn't do anything to help that because of our practices. We talked about logging practices, resource extraction practices. We have examples from the early 1800s, even as early as 1825, the Miramichi fire, which it's either Michigan, Minnesota. I think it was in Maine, actually, though. Which are these? So the Peshtigo fire, the Hinckley fire, these are pre-1900, okay? And does anybody know what fueled these fires? Giant fires. And even the big blow up in 1910, which we should know a little bit more. You know what actually caused this stuff? It was a fuels issue. Timber, yes, it was logging. What were we building our houses at that time of? It wasn't tilt-up concrete buildings, right? It was wood. There's a very large demand for wood. So we were cutting, taking the good wood, leaving the slash. Acre after acre after acre of that. And then so there was lots of different causes for ignitions, but railroads were a big cause for ignitions, and then just burning the slash just to get rid of it. So you had these very large 100,000 acre plus fires that were just think of like a fuel model 12 for thousands and thousands of acres, like right up next to towns. Just terrible, catastrophic fires. And really the big blow-up of 1910 was burning a lot of the slash and materials that was left over from the pre-Forest Service people that were in there cutting trees. It really was a fuels issue that was going on then. It wasn't just natural fuels that was being burned in. So it was a fuels issue. So then we move into controversy in California. It's interesting. I love being in California because a lot of this early debate actually occurred in California. If you go and start reading some of these historical books, especially this this light burning concept. This light burning concept really originated from the timber company owners in the Sierras that saw the native practices of light burning, and then they just happened to see the natural fire regimes. I mean, they understood the fire regimes that were out there. These were timber company owners. They wanted their timber stands not to burn down, basically, so they wanted to be able to do these maintenance burns. And it had a lot of supporters, especially in the Bay Area. There's some really old articles from like Sunset Magazine that came down and were supporting this principle of light burning. So I know guys don't want you to think that 1910 hit, giant fires occurred, and then everybody in America said, yes, we must put all of the fires. There was a debate that occurred about what the reaction to that should be. And a lot of people thought that we should put more fire into the ecosystem. They recognized it at the time that that was the right thing to do. There was a discussion, an argument about it publicly and also in the literature. So one of the responses in the late 1800s was that the forest reserve system was set up. 1891, forest reserves, and it wasn't not in the Department of Agriculture. It was actually in the Department of the Interior. The reasons that they set up these forest reserves was for watershed, which has always been important, especially here, but in many other places, watershed protections, because a lot of watersheds were being degraded, and also for timber protection, because what was happening is you had people just out there free reign, cutting down the trees and leaving it, and just leaving it a mess. Right, so that's why you were having these big fires in the late 1800s. It's interesting to note that our precursor to the forests were actually started in the Department of the Interior. 1891, same year, the Forest Reserve. Okay, yeah, well, this is the same thing. So what happened was that the Forest Reserve Act was passed, gave the president the power to set aside these forest reserves. So it was actually executive order level that they set them up. And then 1897, a few years later, there's an Organic Act. If you guys have ever heard of an Organic Act, an Organic Act is just an act that creates an agency. So whenever a new agency occurs, you have what's called an Organic Act. The 1897 one gave some direction on how these forest reserves were to be utilized, gave a little more direction. At that time, timber, was like one of the number one resources in North America. So there was a lot of interest in how to manage it, how to create it to be sustainable, so it doesn't all get cut down. And the things that were in this was to protect and improve the forest, to provide a permanent supply of timber, to ensure conditions for continuous water flow. Does that sound familiar at all? So what we're doing now, would you say that's really any different?
It's still what we do.
It's still what we do, exactly. From before 1900, it's still what we're trying to do, more or less. So this gets a little more relevant. 1901, you get the USDA, which is the Department of Agriculture. This is a parallel track. Okay, so this is separate. The USDA created a division of forestry, which soon became the USDA Bureau of Forestry. That was 1901. 1905, which is, what's the year they always say the Forest Service was born? 1905. Well, what actually happened in 1905 was this thing called the Transfer Act, and this was very, very important, at least for us. To much consternation to the Department of Interior, we transferred the forest reserves that were in the Interior Department, right? Transferred it to the USDA, and then the Bureau of Forestry was renamed to the United States Forest Service by, of course, Gifford Pinchot. This is what happened. This is how we got our start with the Forest Service. So there is whole books about this between the Secretary of the Interior at the time, which I can't remember his name, and Gifford Pinchot fighting, but it all came down to Theodore Roosevelt coming down on the side of Pinchot, being friends with him, agreeing with this idea of conservation, which is what we do. This is why the Forest Service and the Department of Agriculture, we follow the concept of conservation, which is different than the other concept that the Department of Interior does, which is, you know what that is? Preservation, yeah. And you could probably make some arguments with the Bureau of Land Management, but for the most part, Fish and Wildlife Service and Park Service especially follows this, I don't know what you call it, mission of preservation. So the National Park Service is trying to create this, snapshot in time of where these were. And, it's obviously got more complicated. But conservation is utilization. Conservation is actually utilizing. So you guys might have noticed that, especially on Forest Service lands, we actually cut trees down for timber, right? We actually mine. We have special uses. We have cell phone towers. How many mines and cell phone towers have you seen in Yosemite National Park?
No.
Approximately not too many, because they're trying to preserve it. Okay, they're not using resource extraction. There's some examples in the Grand Canyon where they had been doing some mining earlier, but that got squashed. So, I mean, if you just think about the fundamental mission of the Forest Service, we were trying to allow people to use the resource that's there, but also conserve it for future generations to also have it available to them. Where the Park Service and these other agencies are just trying to preserve what they have and keep it in good shape. And I'm not denigrating them at all. I'm simply trying to illustrate the difference between the two agencies. And it goes back to the root of why we wear the Department of Agriculture on our patch and they wear the Department of Interior on theirs. So anyway, not until 1907, however, were the forest reserves renamed the National Forest. So it's a bit of a misnomer to say that the Forest Service, the National Forests have been around since 1905. Because the forest reserves were there for 2 years. So it's a bit of history. It's important to know. Okay, so this is what I really like to talk about. Going back to that whole light burning argument. In the very beginning, there was what I like to consider a missed opportunity right at the beginning to do it right. So now we talk about we've had 100 and some years, 110, 115 years of fire suppression, which is what we've been going at. But initially, that wasn't necessarily our course. Like nowhere in our Organic Act or anything does it say, okay, now you're the Forest Service and you go start putting out those fires. Right? They said, here's the forest, here's the reserves, conserve it, and then it became a personality thing about what we should do, especially in terms of fire suppression. And even back then, fires happened. Fires were the most dramatic thing. Fires were the thing that got people's attention. What happened is that early in the Forest Service's creation, we kind of came under from attack. There was a lot of people. The Secretary of the Interior at the time really wanted all those lands back, because what is land? Land. It's resources, but it's power, it's budget, it's all the things that a bureaucracy wants to have, right? They want to have, like, if the Department of Interior lost 190 million acres of itself, that really kind of takes it out of being a power player. So there was a lot of people that were really attacking the Forest Service at the time. They didn't really like the Forest Service, especially, think about early 1900s, Industrial Revolution, resource extraction, let's make America great, private business ventures, people that wanted to make money off the landscape. Do you think they want it locked up at the Forest Service behind forest wardens that aren't going to let them just cut as many trees as they want like they had been? No. So there was a lot of people from the private side, from the Department of the Interior and other places that wanted us to go away, wanted the Forest Service to go away and get the lands back. So we had to defend our existence. Forest Service wears a white hat. You know what I mean by that? We wanted to be the good guys. The white hat, black hat concept in Western? Nobody watches Western movies?
Yes,
Like old, you don't like Western movies from 1943? Hopalong Cassidy? Anyway, so yeah, the old one said the good guys always wore the white hat, and the bad guys wear black hats and smoke. They set fires. So I think we took the easy way out. We wore the white hat. What's the white hat? Everyone loves a firefighter, right? Yeah, everyone loves a firefighter. So we're like, oh, hey, we can do that. And then several things aligned early in our history that allowed us to step into that role. Well, the first one was a little policy thing, Weeks Act. We were able to, a lot of these early actually had to do with one, gaining land, and the other is cooperative fire protection, where we can go and help the states put out fires. So we're like, hey, well, not only we can put out the fires, but we'll help you put out the fires as well. And everyone's like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And then the Southeast is interesting because a lot of the traditional practices of burning, as you all know or should know, is that they've actually held out there, right? They kind of defied some of what we were doing. Burning went underground, in a way. It did.
It's not noticeable at all.
Not at all. Okay, so then anyway, so policies shifted to suppression rather than management through the 1920s. A lot of our traditional, I should say traditional practices denigrated, and the traditional practices of, like, say, burning, light burning, and that sort of thing. We had people like W.B. Greeley, who was an early chief, who was a very staunch person when it comes to fire suppression. There's also this Clemensian Climax Model, which came out in 1916, which is that. An interesting thing about this, so you guys all heard about, have you guys heard of a Climax model, a successional model? You guys ever heard of succession on the landscape? Where you start with the grass, and then a brush comes in, and then after the brush comes in, a tree comes in. After a tree comes in, maybe a bigger tree comes in, and then maybe another type of tree comes in, and eventually it reaches a steady state. And then if you get rid of all that or burn, something comes through, it goes back to the beginning. Well, this Clemens, I think it's Robert Clemens? Anyway, this Climax model came out, and that did not include fire at all. Like, fire was not a part of it. Okay, disturbance was not a part of it. It was all climate-driven. And at the time, these climate-driven Climax models were what everyone believed at the time. Right now, I think you guys probably understand this just inherently, even if you've never heard of successional modeling, is that disturbance. We know that disturbance sets back a landscape. So what are some types of disturbances on the landscape? Go.
Some of these like roads. So like
A road would be a disturbance, yeah. Yeah. Okay, what else?
like a rock slide?
Yeah, landslide is a great example of a disturbance for sure.
Mastication.
Mastication would probably be a disturbance. You're absolutely right, it would be. That's us creating a disturbance.
Natural.
I'm talking about natural disturbances specifically.
Just keep on saying mastication, right? I'm gonna get right.
I like it.
You know, high level rains like in Okinawa, that changes the landscape.
Yeah, flooding.
Earthquakes.
Yeah, for sure. How about fire?
Volcanoes blowing up out of
Volcanoes. There's all sorts of it. Now, those are disturbances. Now, maybe somebody... Dinosaurs with drip torches?
Just big feet.
T-Rex.
Big heavy feet.
Maybe somebody will come up with another one, but for the most part, we're pretty much at a point where we believe in non-endpoint disturbance successional models. In other words, things will... there's some places probably will get to some sort of steady state, but everything's always changing. And then what drives that is disturbance. So there's sort of this theory that something will come in and disturb that ecosystem, and it will set it back, or it'll change it, or it will change the trajectory even. Type conversion is a disturbance as well, too, right? Too much fire, that's a disturbance. Not enough fire is a disturbance. We're going to talk about that next time in the fire ecology part. All right, everyone keeping up with me? Am I explaining this all right? Is it right? Those of you guys that know? All right, I think it is. All right, moving on. And we're going to take a break in a little bit. Maybe a quarter or so. You guys good now? All right, cool. So anyway, Great Depression. Okay, so right now we're talking about things that allowed us to have a full suppression fire mantra. Okay, things that helped out. So the Climax model, we jumped onto that. We're like, hey, Clement said no fire is part of it, so obviously we shouldn't have any fire, right? We'll go put those fires out. Just give us some money to do it and hire some seasonals. All right, Great Depression happens, enables a huge workforce to be available for us to actually affect this total suppression. Basically, we got a bunch of people to come work for us for free, right? Because they were there building roads, building cabins and all this sort of thing. And hey, since you're here, we have a fire over here. Do you mind helping us put this out? And that lasted for a little less than a decade, but it did enable us to have a workforce to actually do this total fire suppression doctrine. And then in 1935, we have this 10 a.m. policy, which is pretty famous, right? 10 a.m. Everyone know what the 10 a.m. policy is? What is it?
Fire out by 10 a.m. the next day.
There's more to it, though. Hold every fire to 10 acres or less, and put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And if you don't get it, then you get it by 10 a.m. the next day. So they don't only give you one day to do it. It's 10 a.m. every day. That's the full. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a 10 a.m. policy. This was institutionalized by the 5th Chief of the Forest Service. And then as soon as we had that, changes became evident, after that. 10 a.m. policy really, 10 a.m. policy and doctrine of us going and doing total fire suppression changed the vegetation. Changed the fire regime. Okay, G. Pinchot, Gifford. You guys know him, First Chief? originator of the Forest Service, he said, wisely, today we understand that forest fires are wholly within the control of men and women. You know what I'm saying? Today we understand that forest fires are wholly within the control of men. Do you guys agree with that? Is Gifford right? Do you think Gifford believed that?
He said it.
He said it. It must be true.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I saw it on the internet. So it must be true.
I don't think it's true, but he said it, so he must have believed it enough to say it.
Hell yeah, he believed it. Even if he didn't believe it, he probably could try to convince himself, because this doctrine is what led the Forest Service for our first 30 years of existence, is that, hey, you trust us, we know what we're doing. And the whole Forest Service trust us lasted into the 80s. But it really did until the whole clear cutting debacle. But anyway, yeah, no, hell yeah, they believed that. That forest fires are wholly... I mean, we laugh at this now, but this was our founder. This is what Gifford said. And then Henry Graves, the second chief, wrote that fire prevention is the fundamental, Sue, it's the fundamental obligation of the Forest Service and takes precedence over all duties and activities. So while you're painting your sign, you need to think about it. Your fundamental obligation of the Forest Service is to take...
Thank you, Henry.
prevent fire. I mean, these guys were all in with this.
Well, I think Pinchot had to say something that bold in order to get
The money.
buy-in from everybody else.
Absolutely. He had to be 100% into it. I honestly don't know if he believed it or not. I don't know. Do you guys know?
But it worked.
I think he believed it. At that point, I mean, this was again, you have to think about the mindset of the people in the early 1900s. These are some not screwing around people. These are the guys that were going with like 2 sandwiches and a loaf of bread to explore the Arctic. You know what I mean? Like it's a can-do attitude. Can-do attitude.
There's seals up there. So,
Shackleton.
see,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
suggesting.
this is why we have a can-do attitude, because GP said,
Well,
okay,
prevention
yes.
he probably means too, is the public was changed then. The forests were probably pretty huge, but, you know, they had to tell get the public on board to even have that to exist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. Like, if this is your house, and this is the house that you're going to live and exist in, do you want your house to burn down?
Right.
No, if it all burns down, there's not much of a point. And the other thing is the Forest Service had to demonstrate that it was an effective agency, that it could not only take this money, but it could achieve that mission. So that's why, I mean, it had to exist. It sounds silly, but it literally had to exist. There had to be a forest for them to protect. Otherwise, you know, you're like on the Miwok district of the Stanislaus now. You don't have a district anymore. It all burned down. Right? Hey, tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not calling anybody out. It's not their fault. They had the ring fire. But, I mean, they didn't want the entire national forest system to be, like, you know, gone. So this is, I mean, they were serious about it. Okay, but at the same time, 1902, H.J. Ostrander, this is a guy that wrote in the Sunset magazine, a light-burning advocate. Scientists say that in order to preserve the forest from fire, sarcastically, think snarkily here, scientists say that in order to preserve the forest from fire, pine needles shall be allowed to accumulate, that dead brush shall be not burned out, and fallen trees shall not be disturbed. What's his point here? He's being snarky, isn't he?
Yeah.
Scientists, the Forest Service. You, Forest Service. That in order to preserve the forest from fire, we will just, you know, let this stuff. So he knew it. No, he said, burn and burn often in order this accumulation. It's not become so great as to cause the destruction of trees when a fire sweeps through the mountains. So who do you think was right?
I guess.
Which guy? Don't you talk shit about GP in front of me. I got his picture on my wall. For real, you can go in my office, you can look. I'm dead serious. Who was in there? Ray, did you see him? Alright, he's in there. Who was right? Do we really know who was right? What is right?
It's all situational.
I think
That's a perception.
Pinchot was alluding to what Ostrander said,
Yeah.
that by us maintaining the lands, then we could control the fires easier.
Well, yeah, both of them were trying to get to the same end state, right? Both of them wanted the same thing. Would you agree? They wanted to preserve the landscape. One includes fire and one doesn't. I guess conceivably, if GP was correct that we could wholly control fires, then we really wouldn't have an issue, would we? If we could do that, if we could put out all the fires under 10 acres, would we have an issue? A fire issue? We might have a whole host of other issues. but we wouldn't have a fire issue. But have we demonstrated that we can do that? Hey, I love you guys too, but no, we can't do it all the time. We just can't. We're not that good. We don't have the technology, whatever. Okay. So moving on, 30s through the 70s, a lot of research focused on fire suppression. In fact, the Forest Service, another thing that it ferreted itself into is that, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the Forest Service is, of the 5 federal land management agencies, who has the fire research labs? What's that? What'd you say? Of the 5 federal land management agencies, who has the fire research labs?
We do.
We do. You guys ever thought about that? There's no Park Service Pacific Southwest Fire Lab, all Forest Services, because way back in the 30s, we said, hey, Congress, we're the Forest Service, we're really good at fighting fires, we need to research the heck out of this if we're going to know what we're doing. Oh, and by the way, why don't you have the Forest Service get all the money and the personnel and the staff, and we'll build the fire labs and the forest product laboratory and all that sort of thing. Yeah, so I mean, these guys were good. They knew what they were doing back then. So all the other agencies are dependent upon our fire research. We own it. And all the research, was it about ecosystem management in 1941? No, fire suppression. I mean, all these papers, these countryman papers that came out, before that, these other authors, I can't remember anyway, I can't remember some of those authors, but all they spent time on was looking at how do we put out fires, how do we do firefighter production capability, national fire danger rating system, all these things that built this incredible machine that we're a part of now. And was all the papers and stuff that they researched how to do. Not a whole lot on ecosystem effects. Not a whole lot on that. We really didn't know. I guess one way you can cop out of it is we didn't really know it was altered until, too late. And of course we get Dr. Biswell and others who renewed in the 50s. They renewed the argument for light burning. They literally brought it like a phoenix from the flame. They brought back the argument for light burning because they saw those changes. Biswell was a small voice, but he had a lot of influence, and he also had access to the academia. So universities began to start doing the. University.
They don't touch me. Break time?
Yeah, let's take a break. Wait, hold on. Let me finish my point. The universities started filling that void of, the ecological aspects that other people started to be interested in. In the 50s was really the very, very beginning of sort of that alternative movement. It was that post-World War II generation. Not necessarily wanting to listen to everything that the man has to say. So, all right. Yeah, I don't know what the hell's going on with power, but what's going on, Laura?
You know what? I don't know. I was just checking to make sure the emergency lighting is working. So
We're good.
That's good.
All right. Let's take 10 minutes.
We're doing an emergency blast test.
But you were saying it was the 50s that was being discussed, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like,
I know, right?
they had a lot of more time where nobody was around at all.
And like the tables
Yeah, exactly. There was a lot of research.
I know, dude. Paranormal activity fun.
Interesting stuff too. They actually started doing research
I know, right?
on the fire bombings.
Yeah.
For the fire bombings, that they actually got to see some of these like mass ignition. There's some really interesting papers that came from. I mean, that's kind of terrible about what it came from. But yeah, it's interesting. All right, we got power back.
They'll recognize.
Well, when those fires